Asics Novablast 5 versus the Asics Novablast 4. What's changed, what's new, and which one is right for you? It's that time of year again. It's Novablast season. And last year's Novablast 4 and this year's Novablast 5 on paper seem like they're kind of the same shoe. The specs are very similar. But the reality is, on foot and on the run, that couldn't be further from the truth. And the best place to start to tell how these two shoes differ is to look at the specs. Now, as you can see, these stack heights in the drop are identical between the Novablast 5 and last year's Novablast 4. The one difference I will point out is that the drop feel of the Novablast 5 feels like an 8mm drop. It could feel a little bit lower, and that's mostly because the foam is more compressive. Whereas in the Novablast 4, it did feel like an 8mm drop. It could feel a little bit higher. I did feel like I was more up on my toes in the Novablast 4. But from a weight standpoint, these two shoes are nearly identical. The Novablast 5 is slightly lighter weight, but you're not going to really feel that difference. And the ride of these two shoes is really one of springy for the Novablast 5 and soft for the Novablast 4. The ride is much more dynamic in the Novablast 5, and that has a lot to do with the FF Blast Max one-piece midsole. It's Asics' new foam, and I'll talk more about that in the ride section of this video. The other difference between these two shoes is they both have forefoot rocker. However, because the foam in the Novablast 4, the FF Blast Plus Eco foam, is just a little bit firmer, you definitely feel the forefoot rocker quite a bit more in the Novablast 4. There's a much more pronounced sort of falling forward feeling in the Novablast 4. Whereas with the Novablast 5, the foam is again so soft and compressive that you're kind of just flattening it out, which I think makes the shoe much more versatile. And moving to the bottom of these two shoes and looking at the width that's actually contacting the ground, there is another subtle difference here. And I think this is one of the major differences between these two shoes. As you can see, overall, the Novablast 5 is slightly narrower than the Novablast 4. 3 to 5 millimeters, across the board, but it's the entire shoe. And that makes a huge difference because the Novablast 5 feels much more nimble, much more agile underfoot. And looking at the outsole patterns of these two shoes, this also speaks to how they ride differently. Starting with the Novablast 5, we have a much simpler rubber outsole pattern on this shoe. There's the rails of rubber that run from really the forefoot to the heel on both the medial and lateral side. Then there's a U across the front of the forefoot. And the trampoline effect, which is the area that's right in the middle of the forefoot, is much more prominent. It's shifted towards the toe, forward in the shoe, and there's much more rubber coverage, giving you the effect that you actually have more rubber underfoot. But you're still getting that soft, compliant feel of the exposed foam, which is really signature for a Novablast ride. The rubber compound in the Novablast 5 is Asics' Ahar Low, which I'm finding to be extremely grippy and very durable. It's kind of the best mix of both of those things. Whereas in the Novablast 4, the rubber sections had a lot more grooves and pattern on them, but I don't think any of it really did much. I never really struggled for grip with the Novablast 4, but the grip in the Novablast 5 is much better. And the underfoot feel of the Novablast 5, because of the simpler rubber, and actually there's more rubber in contact with the ground, just is a much more sure-footed feel. It's a really significant difference between the two shoes and how they feel on foot. Moving to the upper and fit of these two shoes, I'm going to be honest up front, I don't find these two shoes fitting drastically any different from each other. They are both US men's size 9, which is true to size for me, and they fit my foot nearly identical, though there is a subtle difference, but I don't think it has anything to do with the last of these two shoes. I actually think they're probably the same last. I don't know that for sure, but it sure feels like that to my foot. But the upper material on these two shoes is quite different, and that contributes to the very different feel on foot. Starting with the Novablast 5, what Asics calls this upper material is a technical mesh material, and I described it in my 50-mile review of this shoe, link in the description if you want to see all the details on this shoe, as a little bit more plasticky feeling. But I actually do find it a little bit more flexible too. It actually drapes around the foot much better. It's a much more flexible material. But I think the real difference in the Novablast 5 over the Novablast 4 and the fit in the forefoot of this shoe has to do with this internal toe bumper that's in this shoe. Now, this is an internal piece that runs from about here on the lateral side and about here on the medial side, wraps all the way around the toe, curls over a little bit. That's there to keep the material up off the toe, but also protect the toe. And the shape of this, I think, has changed. In the Novablast 5, it starts about here and it goes down about here, wraps here, and then it starts to dip to where it ends. So it's actually very long around here and then dips quite suddenly. What that's doing is keeping this upper material up off of the side of the foot. So it's giving the impression that this shoe is wider in the forefoot, where I don't think it is. It's just that the material is kept off of the toes quite a bit more by this toe bumper. And then the more flexible and frankly more breathable technical mesh of the Novablast 5 does a good job of just draping over the foot in a much more flexible, lighter way. And that, I think, contributes to the feel of this shoe being more open in the forefoot, where I don't think there's actually any more room. And in the Novablast 4, Asics called this upper a woven upper, and it is a much firmer material. I actually thought this was a softer, looser material, but when I put this back on my foot, it really isn't. This is a much more rigid woven material. It's much less breathable, it retains water much more, but it also sits on the foot much closer, and that's a couple things by the design of this upper material. One, the toe bumper, which is still present in the shoe, just like the Novablast 5, is slightly different shape. It ends about the same place on the lateral side and about the same place on the medial side, but the shape of it is more, it goes here, 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 and now it starts to drop quite low, and it continues into where it ends. But the drop is very sudden, so the actual ridge of the toe bumper only goes to about here, and then it drops quite suddenly. And the effect of that is that this woven material, which is stiffer on the foot, sits down on the foot much more, and it actually wraps into where it rolls under on top of the midsole where the insole is much more suddenly. So the effect of this on the foot is that it feels like it's tighter. I don't think it is, because over the 100 miles I put on this shoe, it actually opened up and flexed, and I never had any real fit issues with this shoe. But putting both shoes on my feet, I did notice that this sits on the foot much tighter. Additionally, you can see these ridges on this upper material. That also stiffens this material, so it's much less flexible on the foot as well, which, again, you really notice the difference between the Novablast 4 and the Novablast 5. Now, looking at both of these shoes on my feet, you can see that when I press where my big toe is in both these shoes, they're fundamentally in the same place. And when I wiggle my toes in both these shoes, you can see how much more flexible the upper is on the Novablast 5. And I think that has a lot to do with the feel of this shoe on foot. And looking at the rest of the fit of these two shoes and looking at the eyelet chain and the midfoot lockdown, they fundamentally lock down in the same way. I did say last year that the eyelet chain in the Novablast 4 is a little bit too fussy, and it is, but it worked very well. The eyelet chain in the Novablast 5 is a little bit simpler, but you have the same amount of lacing options between these two shoes, and again, they lock down in the same way. They both have a gusseted tongue. They both have a neoprene-like tongue that's got some padding in it, though the Novablast 5 now has the same tongue as what's in the Superblast 2, which I think is a little upgrade, but it's not substantially changing how the shoe laces down. And in the heel of these two shoes, they have the same amount of ankle collar padding, the Achilles flare is the same, and there's a deep pocket in the back of both of these shoes. There should be no heel lift issues in either one of these shoes. So other than the draping of the upper material in the forefoot of these two shoes, they fit identically to me on my feet. And moving to the midsole of these two shoes, this is really where a lot of the differences come from. Now, going to the Novablast 5, this has Asics' latest FF Blast foam, FF Blast Max, which I described in my 50-mile review of the shoe as being all of the fun parts of FF Blast Plus without any of the non-fun parts, the break-in period and the way it just sort of gets spongy after a certain point. This is just fun, energetic, springy, or bouncy, depending on how you want to define that, and it's very resilient. There's a lot of pop off of the toe in this shoe. It is a softer foam, but it's a more resilient foam. You're sinking into this foam and you're bouncing out of it more. It's not racing super foam level, but for a training foam, it's very dynamic, very fun to run in. And in the Novablast 4, last year I described the FF Blast Plus Eco Foam in this shoe as a consistent version of FF Blast Plus, which has not always been the most consistent foam to me. And over 100 miles in this shoe last year, I did find that to be the case. This was not quite as dynamic as FF Blast Plus. It was a little bit firmer, though I would still call this a soft foam. It just didn't have that sort of pop, but more importantly, it was very consistent from the initial sort of 5K breaking this shoe in, past 100 miles. I had a very consistent, very pleasant, sort of cushioned, long run shoe experience. I really enjoyed this foam, but the FF Blast Max foam in the Novablast 5 is a definite upgrade. Another big difference between the tooling and the midsoles of these two shoes is in the heel, and you can see that when you look at them side by side. The outrigger that's in the heel on the Novablast 4 is now gone in the Novablast 5, and I think by doing that they've reduced a lot of the bulk in the heel of the Novablast 5 that was present in the 4, and they brought in the heel bevel just a little bit in the 5. They brought it just a little bit back, I think, which makes this shoe a much more smooth heel strike and transition in the midfoot and off the toe of the shoe. Just makes it just feel much more natural. There's just less bulk back here, though you still have all of this sort of support and the bucket seat feel for your heel with the midsole wrapping up around it. That gives a lot of stability back here for heel striking, but you're just getting a smoother transition without all of the extra foam that was back here in the 4. I think this is a much better resolved heel and engineering in the Novablast 5. Another factor that contributes to the ride difference between these two shoes can be seen from above when you're looking down at the shoe. You can see how much more lateral and medial flaring in the forefoot there is on the Novablast 4. It's much more prominent. It's still on the Novablast 5, but I think it's resolved much better. There's still stability on the medial and lateral sides, but it's just not as prominent as the Novablast 4. In fact, if I lay over the Novablast 4 on top of the 5, you can see how much more width, especially on the medial side, there is in the 4. And the effect of that is that the Novablast 5 is just a much more nimble shoe. As I said, there's still stability. You can see the outriggers in the forefoot of this shoe. They're just much more subtle. They're just much more better resolved in the tooling of the midsole of this shoe. Whereas on the 4, you can see just how extreme they are, just how much they stick out. It made this shoe very stable, but it also made this shoe just feel very wide sometimes. It could feel very clunky to run in, especially at slower speeds. And I think this was a better sort of slow, long run, easy run type shoe. But it could feel a little wide at sometimes, and I think that actually limited the usability of the shoe for faster running, at least for me. Whereas in the Novablast 5, it's just, again, a very nimble, very fun shoe that still has the stability from the 4, but just in a package that can do a lot more and never seems to get in the way. It's really quite nice engineering that Asics has done here in the changes to the 5. And another big change, which I've already talked about, but it has to do with the trampoline effect that's in the forefoot of both these shoes. As you can see when I put them side by side, the Novablast 5's trampoline effect, which is the piece of rubber in the middle of the forefoot of both of these shoes, is just much more prominent on this shoe, and it's shifted forward towards the toes, which gives the more poppy, more propellant feel in the Novablast 5 over the 4. You still would get some of that in this shoe, but you can just see how much less prominent it is in this shoe. It's very front and center in this shoe, but not in an annoying way at all. And as a forefoot striker who is landing up on my toes, I am landing right on this trampoline effect now. So this more prominent trampoline effect combined with the FF Blast Max foam in here, which is more resilient, has more energy return, means I'm getting a much more dynamic, springy or bouncy pop off the toe in this shoe. Again, for a training shoe, it's very dynamic, and I think combine that with the nimbleness of the revised geometry in this shoe, and I'm getting a shoe that just has a lot of energy return, has a lot of bounce and pop off the toe, and can just do a lot more, and it's a really great feeling. And the last thing I want to point out between the midsole differences in these two shoes is the forefoot rocker. Now, I think the forefoot rocker is the same between these two shoes. If anything, there's a little bit less in the Novablast 5, But the differences in the foam make these two shoes ride very differently. In the Novablast 4, FF Blast Plus Eco is a firmer foam. Still a foam I consider very soft, it's just firmer, meaning the shoe flexes less than the Novablast 5. So the forefoot rocker is much more prominent in this shoe. You do have much more of a rolling forward or falling forward feel in this shoe. In the Novablast 5, because of the FF Blast Max foam being much more flexible, I feel like I'm actually flattening out the rocker more in the shoe, and I'm not feeling that propellant forward feel of a rocker, which I like because I don't like a lot of rocker in a shoe, especially in a trainer. And I think this shoe is just a much better ride because of that. And I think it speaks to the versatility in the shoe because I can do a lot more in the shoe because I'm not fighting the rocker every step of the way. Another way to describe the differences between these two shoes is with my performance matrix. Now, starting with the Novablast 5, you can see there is a huge range for this shoe. This is that versatility that I've been talking about this entire video. It really covers all of these areas, though the red area is the real sweet spot. I think this shoe is happiest going from the top end of easy into steady or steady into threshold. It really likes to be in that space. But surprisingly, once you get into threshold or race pace or beyond that into max effort, like interval rep type running, really fast running, the Novablast 5 does extremely well, surprisingly well. For the Novablast 4, you can see that the range is much smaller, but it's much more targeted. It really likes to be in that easy to steady range. And once I got the Novablast 4 up into threshold, I just found that it wasn't the best. It was a combination of I just wasn't getting enough from the foam. The rocker was sort of getting in the way for me. Again, I don't like a lot of rocker in shoes, especially trainers. And just in general, I thought the Novablast 4 was an excellent long run, easy trainer or cruiser, but it just didn't do that threshold and definitely didn't do max effort running very well. And again, I think this speaks to a lot of the design tweaks, the added nimbleness, the new foam, and everything they've done with the Novablast 5, just truly making it an all-around daily trainer that can do everything. So what's the verdict here? Which one of these two Novablasts do I prefer? Well, it should be pretty obvious at this point. I find the Novablast 5 to be an excellent update. The nimbleness, the foam in the shoe, the pop off the toe, the agility of this shoe, and the versatility in the shoe make this shoe truly an all-around daily trainer for me now. I can't say that for previous versions of the Novablast. It's not to say I didn't like the Novablast 4. This is one of my favorite shoes of 2024, but it was a long run sort of cruiser shoe for me. A lot of easy running in the shoe, and it did that really well, but it didn't do a lot of other stuff. That's completely changed with the Novablast 5. This shoe does it all, and it's quite a bit of fun no matter where you're going to take this shoe. So as Asics' first 2025 shoe, this is exciting for the direction that Asics is going to take next year. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you find this content useful, consider subscribing. You'll see more content from me pop up in your feed. If not, drop a like on this video because it helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.